Welcome to A Growing Concern. We're going to talk a little bit about Portland's drinking water tonight. We'll let our guest fill you in on a little bit about the situation when we bring him up. His name is Scott Fernandez. He's with a group called Friends of Safe Drinking Water. It has to do with Cryptosporidium, which is a parasite that apparently it's not quite as scary as some people think that it is, or at least try to believe that it is. So we'll just go right into it. Scott's got a 45-minute or so PowerPoint presentation that he's developed on this, and we'll just go into it. Welcome to the program, Scott.
Well, thank you. We're going to be talking tonight, giving an overview of our bull run system and how the EPA regulation that they're trying to make us go with is going to affect our system in many different ways through the sustainability and the ecological and the economic and the social ways that it's going to affect us, and how in the end we don't need this EPA regulation because we don't have a problem. And so we'll show you tonight how that works and how our system works really well as it does right now without any treatment. We don't need any added treatment, and we don't need to cover our reservoirs. Our water is perfectly safe. It's pure organic bull run water that needs to be left alone.
So EPA is Environmental Protection Agency. It's a federal agency, and they're demanding that we cover our reservoirs and go through do they want us to cleanse the water as well?
They want to add treatment. Right now they're proposing that we use ultraviolet radiation, which has its own problems, and we'll show a little bit about that a little bit later on through the PowerPoint, and then cover our reservoirs that have no problems as they currently are right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't want to get too much into anything you're going to be covering later, but this has been going on for 3 years? Did I get that right?
This has been going on for, in Portland, we've had to deal with this for the last decade.
Right.
And also, this goes back to 1993 with a sewage event that took place in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And so we'll start with that. We'll go through the history of that and how that leads to where we are today, and what the community can do as a whole today in addressing this issue and getting our elected representatives to ask for a waiver from this regulation.
Right. So so we're not the first city that's had to deal with this issue then? So.
No, this is a national issue, and right now other cities have fought it, one of them being New York, and so hopefully we can prevail with our waiver.
All right. Well, I know that you set this up to give a little bit of history of this all, so we'll just bring that PowerPoint up, and then you can just get going on it, and I'll kind of look over your shoulder here to make sure that it's clear, and we'll just move along.
Okay, thank you. This is the formal name, the EPA LT2, which is the Long-Term 2 Enhanced Surface Water Treatment Rule, and then another rule that we're dealing with is the Stage 2 Disinfection Byproduct Rule. And for the audience, this will be posted on the website, Friends of Safe Drinking Water. It is under construction right now and should be available for you to review next week. But of all the things you're going to see tonight, the Regional Transmission and Storage Strategy Report, which you can find if you just Google that, is extremely important because this represents the blueprint that the engineers in the area put out for us to drink Willamette and Columbia River water blended with the Bull Run water. And this is one of the parts of the equation that is really important that we don't want to do. We don't want to drink Willamette River water. And then another article, how much is nature worth? This is really important, the value of the New York City watershed, and then the Safe Drinking Water, Friends of Safe Drinking Water website. These are more materials that support what we're saying. The EPA, the scientists are unhappy about the political meddling that took place, not only with this regulation, but with many others. And this next one addresses the debt that we're incurring right now. The Portland Water Bureau is at about a 40% debt on their budgets. And also a New York Times article that tap water may be legal but is unhealthy. And this relates to the EPA regulations of chemicals that they regulate, which is fewer than 100. And so we'll see more about that later on tonight. That the science that is involved has been interfered with by politics getting involved and saying, well, we think maybe you should have an outcome that kind of sways the conclusions in this direction, and that's what it really comes into play with. There's been a lot of political influence and conflict of interest that we've seen all the way through this regulation, and we'll see more about that too.
Okay, sure.
This is my background. My graduate work was in drinking water chemistry and microbiology from Washington State University, and I've served on the Portland Utility Review Board and the Portland Water Quality Advisory Committee. And my personal email address is at the bottom, SF4164. This is one of the things that we're dealing with right now. This is a defective covered reservoir that took place in Seattle. They're removing the petrochemical-based membrane that is, you see that right there, the orange thing, because it was breaking down and then leaking into the reservoir below it. And this is what will be happening to us if we continue down this road with this regulation. The same person, the same engineering group that built this defective reservoir, and there was more than one, is going to be building ours. Now these petrochemicals release and break down through bacteria breaking them down, and then they find their way through the cracks and the holes in these covered reservoirs into the drinking water, combined with benzene. The benzene from these things combines with chlorine, you get chlorobenzene, and it's a very negative chemical that we don't need and we don't have right now.
Well, that cover is put there to protect the water, and it ends up adulterating it, is what you're saying.
The covering, we'll see in later slides that this covering is about the worst thing that can happen to a reservoir. The open reservoirs that we have now are really, really good and beneficial to public health. Mm-hmm. So this is a summary of what the engineer involvement was, and this is what we have problems with. The engineers wrote the regulation, the engineers presented the information for the public process, and the engineers administer it from the EPA. I mean, it's all engineer focused. And then the corporate engineer in Portland that has got the contracts to design and build the treatment plan and to cover the reservoirs. I mean, he helped write it. His boss was chair of the EPA Science Committee that oversaw this thing. He wrote the Regional Transmission Storage Strategy Report that is our road to Willamette River and the Columbia River water that we will be drinking, and he has a cozy relationship with the Water Bureau and the Water Bureau administrator here in Portland. So there are distinct conflicts of interest throughout this whole process, and this is part of the political meddling that took place. Mm-mm. This is where it all begins. This is the Blue Lake Reservoir in the Bull Run Management Unit. This is pure water. This is organic water. And the best thing that we have going for us is that there's no sewage from municipal, industrial, agricultural sources. So this really takes a lot of these sewage contaminants, chemicals, and microorganisms off the table, and that's why we don't need to treat other than what we're doing right now.
Maybe elk take a poop in it or something, but all you'll get is natural organic waste that would go into it.
Well, we don't see that as a problem because the Cryptosporidium have not been found in that reservoir since the early 2000s, 2002, and there has been 0 Cryptosporidium that have been found, so they just aren't a problem, and neither are any of the other microorganisms that come from that. It just is a very well-suited, sustainable source of drinking water. And it's federally protected, so there aren't people coming in there. There's sewage, no sewage as I talked about, and decommissioning the roads to reduce the turbidity. And the value that we have there is that 1997, New York City had an independent valuation of their water source, the watershed, at $33 trillion. And by contrast, ours by size, which is about 1/10 of New York's, is valued at $3 trillion approximately. And the Bull Run itself and the management unit is a very distinct natural barrier to contaminants because it doesn't have the sewage in it.
So you're saying the value of the Bull Run watershed is $3 trillion?
Approximately, based on 1997 values. And you'll see later on how we got into problems with that valuation. So here we are today. Each one of the audience members is made up of trillions of cells with billions of chemical reactions going on within their body every second, and they need clean, healthy water. And EPA is forcing us to treat this water for a problem that doesn't exist. The science is flawed. And this is the only regulation I've ever seen that knowingly degrades our water through the added treatment that we don't need and through covering of the reservoirs. And it's going to cost, over time, over $1 billion for no measurable benefit. And we'll provide some solutions at the end of the the discussion tonight.
You may get into it later, but they're going to talk about putting chemicals in there. You're probably going to address that.
Exactly.
All right.
Again, I can't emphasize enough that the audience should read this document, because this outlines the gateway to the Willamette River. In 2002, this relates to the $3 trillion that it was worth. In 2002, I participated in a process called the Bull Run Regional Drinking Water Agency that started in 2001, and they determined that our whole system was only worth $125 million because it had depreciated to zero in their mind. And the idea that our Portland Water Bureau says, well, we'll never go to the Willamette is incorrect, because the Wilsonville plant that pulls from the Willamette is only using 10 million gallons a day now, and it has a capacity of 120 million, and the people that own it, which they're not getting the full use out of it, they want the whole region to be using that. So that, as long as that stays like that, they have over 100 million gallons that is just not being used, so they want to use that throughout the region.
Because they would be making money from it.
They make a lot of money from it.
All right.
And the same engineer that wrote LT2 that is going to get the contracts helped put that whole process together with the Willamette plant in Wilsonville. And this is the source of all Coca-Cola products in our region too. So this is what we're dealing with when we talk about the Willamette. This is a toxic mixing zone in the Willamette, not far from the Wilsonville treatment plant. So this is a representation of what we'll be drinking. This is sewage coming out of there.
Where's it coming out of? A sewage treatment plant?
This is coming out of the sewage treatment plant, and each city and little town has each one of these things like that, like Albany, Corvallis, Eugene.
And they all go into the Willamette.
They all go into the Willamette. They're all toxic, and only 118 chemicals are regulated coming from these things, so there's a lot of stuff that gets through.
So they clean it and discharge it, but it's not clean.
No, it's not. And this is another example of the sewage water that goes into the drink.
Toilet to tap, huh?
Toilet to tap. And they are, the engineers are talking about this right now because they want to reduce the amount of wastewater going into the Willamette. So they say that they can treat this water to be as good or better than Bull Run. They say that right now with the Wilsonville plant, which is ridiculous. So this is why I'm talking about this tonight with the Willamette, because we were very close to drinking Willamette water in 2002. We were one vote away on the Portland City Council, and they didn't have to talk to the citizens. They could do it through an IGA, or intergovernmental agreement, and we were one vote away from that. So 2 out of the 5 council members were ready to go with it. And this is the same thing that's going on now, that we would someday have the Willamette and Columbia River at the Powell Butte Blending Water Center. And we're building a reservoir up at Powell Butte right now that will be leading us down this pathway. The point of this whole thing is, as a community, we stood and said no in 2002, and the city council listened to us, and that's what we have to do again. So right now, we're being told LT2 is a done deal, that we have to cover and reservoirs and add treatment. It's time again now that we say no, we want a waiver, but we have to stand up as a community and tell our elected officials this is what we want. We have to do it, or we're going to be in for a very big public health crisis. Randy Leonard and the Water Bureau and the City Council are very well educated on what these adverse public health effects are and these toxic and carcinogenic chemicals, but they apparently don't care. Leonard, as I said before, is the one who defers to the federal representatives, and the feds refer to the city council for guidance, and we're caught in between. We need to do something as a community. So these toxic chemicals that we're going to be introducing through the treatment and through the covered reservoirs are a universal public health risk, but it's generally the women and children that get the short end of it, and pets. These chemicals will end up, as we'll see in just a minute, will end up in our schools, homes, and businesses. This is a diagram of where we are right now. With the Bull Run at the top, we only use chlorine and ammonia, and occasionally we'll use sodium hydroxide to amend the pH to make it less acidic. But those 2 chemicals are it, and then because we have no sewage, we have very little organic material that these chemicals react with, so we have very little problem with those. The next thing is we have the ultraviolet radiation and the ozone and the filtration that will add formaldehyde, and aldehyde will come from the UV and the ozone. If we go to filtration, we will add alum and acrylamides, and these will generate unknown chemicals. These are all toxic and carcinogenic and have no nutritional benefit at all.
Well, these are added in, but do they distill out, or do they stay in?
They stay in. Like the formaldehyde will react with chlorine, and it will generate off flavors, and different chemicals will react with it and form like ethers. So these things not only are generated by the UV, but they will then react within the system and generate other chemicals, and a lot of them that we don't know about. And then if you get down to the last one, where it has the Willamette River, the Columbia River, and the Columbia South Shore well field, we get all kinds of chemicals that come into it that we don't have right now. The PCBs, nuclear materials from Hanford coming down the the Columbia, and the nuclear materials coming from Teledyne Wah-Chang area around Albany, and the Willamette, and then metals and hormones and pesticides and insecticides and all this other stuff, and that's what we get.
Well, you know, the Willamette Valley is a farming community. There's an awful lot of fertilizers and pesticides and insecticides, as you say. That alone should be enough to stop this.
And the engineers will say they can take all that stuff out. Well, that's not true. Filtration, there's no process that is absolute in removing of these things. Not at all. Not even close. So some of the toxic and carcinogenic chemicals that we're going to be dealing with, one that causes cancer, one that will come from a closed reservoir, is nitrosyl dimethylamine, the NDMA, and that's sunlight will break that down. And so if we have a covered reservoir, that chemical disinfection byproduct will remain in the system. Chloroform will not have a place to vent in a closed reservoir. Radon that we get from the Columbia South Shore well field will have no place to vent. Formaldehyde that is broken down by sunlight, and alum that will be introduced through the filtration process has been linked to the processes involved with breast cancer and with neurological problems. And these other chemicals, these same chemicals can cross the placenta and cause birth defects. So between the open reservoirs and the treatment that we would be seeing, this is where we will end up. This is a real problem. So the effects on children, the EPA only regulates 80 chemicals in drinking water out of 80,000, and these EPA standards are based on a 150-pound person, and they won't tell us that the ultraviolet radiation is generating formaldehyde because it's not regulated. So if it's not regulated, it's still there, but they don't have to disclose it. And we see that the gases that will be coming through the system, if we close our reservoirs like radon, will have a negative impact on the children because their respiration is greater. So they'll be ingesting it through the drinking water and inhaling it through the gases.
So you say the 80 chemicals that are regulated out of 80,000, so that means there's only 80 out of 80,000 that they test for then.
Right.
Anderson Cooper did something on this a while back where he had himself tested, and there was an ungodly amount of chemicals that they found just in his body.
Yeah, that's what happens, and it just, that's all they have to test for, and that's all they have to disclose. So in 2007, we're kind of moving now to the Milwaukee incident. So the Water Bureau acknowledges that the system that Milwaukee had is not close to what we had because of the sewage, and sewage is not possible. So that's their confirmation of what we've been saying. So in the Milwaukee incident in 1993, there was many weeks of malfunctioning treatment plant, and it was based on overflow from sewage discharges into rivers, flooding from feedlots from like cows and stuff, and meatpacking plants, and they were drinking sewage water over a period of many, many weeks. So if you're going to drink sewage water from a defective and malfunctioning water plant, people are going to get sick. This is Cryptosporidium underneath a microscope, just to give the audience an idea of what we're looking at. And this is under immunofluorescent antibody that they put on there to make it visible.
Is that 10? Is that microns or something? That's the size of it?
10 microns is the size. It's generally between 4 and 6 microns, and it'll give them an idea of what they're looking at, because there are other organisms that can give a false positive, and that's another problem that we have in the testing, that we may get a positive of Cryptosporidium, but it could be a yeast, it could be an algae, it could be another microorganism. So a positive doesn't really mean it's there to begin with. So that's another problem with the EPA strategy. So this is a picture of the Milwaukee incident. Those three rivers converged, and that red area right there is the plume of sewage that went down, and there was a northeast wind during that period of weeks, during that flooding, and the intake from the water plant was at the south end, and that's the one that had all the problems. The north end one that we see at the top did not have any problems. So this is a picture of Milwaukee. On the kind of in the middle on the left, I'm sorry, on the right side is where the sewage plant is, the treatment plant, and you can see the debris coming through the rivers here from the flooding at that time. And then the next is the discharge into Lake Michigan, and to the right is where the flow would be going as it goes into the south intake plant. This is a picture from a later discharge of sewage into the Lake Michigan. This sailboat was going through the debris there, and that debris is pretty good accurate color, because that is not anything but human sewage, and it was the description that the skipper gave from that boat was very, I can't repeat it, what he was saying, but it was just very, very disgusting.
Real crappy, huh?
And that's what they were going to be drinking.
So this water goes into the sewage treatment plant south of where it goes in, and then they take it up and they treat it, and then that's the drinking water. Is that the cycle?
That's part of the cycle, right? But it can they've designed it now so they can bypass the sewage treatment plant if they get too much water coming through the sewage system, and it'll go in there raw.
It's hard to believe that EPA would allow that.
That's exactly who gave them the ability to do that. They signed off on that, what they call a bypass. This is just an example of what I wanted to show the audience about the filtration process. Whether you see the one there, that's the standard that's 1 micron, and that's generally the filtration level that will remove Cryptosporidium and Giardia and bacteria. But you can see there that going towards the left, the virus part there, that generally can get through a filtration process. But the point of this whole thing is to show you how Cryptosporidium and Giardia, which are 2 parasites, will be able to go through the filtration process, and you'll see what the meaning of that is in just a minute. These are examples of microorganisms that you would see in a sewage event, and out of all these microorganisms in Milwaukee, they only found Cryptosporidium. And you saw at the earlier one that Cryptosporidium was a rather large organism, and a lot of bacteria and viruses would pass through also. But they only identified Cryptosporidium, which is rather suspect. Okay, we'll move on to the LT2 treatment. That UV radiation is the one that was selected by the City of Portland in 2009, July. The UV treatment in the pilot plant out at the Columbia South Shore well field and through other utilities has a history of bulb and sleeve breakage, releasing mercury into the water, and this is one of our concerns. The sleeves also that surround these bulbs are coated with toxic Teflon to reduce the biofilm buildup. And the Portland Water Bureau does not disclose the disinfection byproducts because it doesn't have to, and we talked about that earlier. It produces formaldehyde. One of the things that they leave out too is that in our system, because our water is so pure that we don't filter it, but every utility that has ultraviolet radiation has a pre-treatment, because these particles that come through, and this is natural organic matter, are interfered with the disinfection process. So we would have to add a filtration process if we're going to use ultraviolet radiation to remove these particles to make the system work properly. But they haven't told us about that, and they haven't disclosed the cost of that, which would be hundreds of millions of dollars. They've left that out of the discussion so that there wasn't a sticker shock for the community. But no other system has UV that doesn't have to pre-treat it. And this describes that also. Ultraviolet is at 100 million now, but it's ultimately, if we go down that road, it's going to cost us more.
Which means it's going to cost the ratepayers.
Which means the ratepayers, yeah. They'll pass that all along. Now we move on to the open reservoirs. One of the key elements about the open reservoirs is it's a wonderful system of sustainability of really providing healthy water. There have been no microbiological or chemical deaths related to open reservoirs ever that we've found, and nothing that has been cited by EPA. On the other hand, closed reservoirs, like what we saw previously, there have been deaths related to salmonella and gases, methane. So it's confusing to the community because these covered reservoirs are supposed to be safer. There's no way that they are. And we saw the problems with the closed reservoirs in Seattle, that they had to redo that. And when they were all done with that, they put on another different type of membrane on the to allegedly keep the water out, but it was still petrochemical based. And the open reservoirs just act as a natural barrier because they vent gases and the sun works really well. One of the things that the engineers tells us that the open reservoirs are obsolete. Well, that's just not true. This is a reservoir that I found going back to thousands of years that was used by the Romans. You can see the aqueduct structure in the upper right-hand corner as it moves around to the side there. But this is used in Istanbul, just outside of Istanbul in Turkey. So the Romans were way ahead of their time in finding that open reservoirs really did provide a function with good public health. This is Reservoir 6 at Mount Tabor, and I wanted this to come in because of the fountain effect adds oxygenation and also allows gases to vent out very efficiently. This is an important part of our open reservoir, and we lose all that if we go to a covered reservoir. The oxygenation and the sunlight work together to provide natural disinfection products. Oxides, we're all familiar with peroxide as being a disinfection product, and the sun and the oxygen works together with that also. It provides a good public health benefit. A year ago, we had a big controversy at Washington Park where we allegedly had a one coliform that was found in the reservoir, and there was a big boil water event, big show by the Water Bureau to reduce the credibility of the open reservoirs. Well, it turned out that they weren't doing things right. This is a picture that came out of the Oregonian during that time, and the person taking that water sample at the reservoir up there was not doing it right. So all the data that they gathered from that process should be thrown out. They didn't, but it should have been because of what we'll see here. This goes against EPA regulations in this technique that they're using here. This is what the EPA says that they should be using, and notice the gloves at the bottom.
I was wondering about that, yeah.
And that's very, very important. If you don't have those, forget it. Just throw it out.
Mm-hmm.
And this will show you how they're supposed to do it. Because even the splashing, whatever, can cause people may not wash their hands at some point during the day, and there's coliforms in your nose and all over your skin. If they just touch their nose and then have a sample of water, it could be very easily contaminated. So that whole event should have been thrown out.
That was a covered, or that was open reservoirs up in Washington Park. Right.
Now this product here I introduced to the Water Bureau almost 4 years ago. This is an early detection thing. It works like a early pregnancy thing, only it detects coliforms, as few as one. So all they would have to do is to take their sample, if they had done it properly, and put it in the water and stir it around, and if they got a reaction like we see the pink up here, that would have been positive. Now, I'm not saying, and no microbiologist will say that we have to rely on this, but it is very good to have an early warning. If they were getting a lot of positives using this in the water, that would be something to consider. You have to do the proper thing, though. Take the water sample and incubate it for 18 hours at least and see if you do get coliforms. But this would be a good way. This was developed at Cornell University, so there's a good substance to it. And this would be a good way to get an early warning detection if you had a problem. But they did not do that.
What is a coliform? What is it? Is that the bacteria and parasites?
Right. It's a bacterium. It's an E. coli, Escherichia coli, and it's in the intestines in animals. And that's what we test for in our drinking water as an indicator of a contamination.
Okay.
And we do that all the time, and our water system has been very good. And this is a diagram of ultraviolet radiation and how sunlight is very effective in producing a good disinfection process. All this would go away in a covered reservoir. So we see really in the middle there between the purple and the red, those are disinfection types of rays that allow these processes in the open reservoirs to be effective. And that would all go away. When I talked earlier, this is the EPA map of radon in Portland. The red or orange part here is the highly toxic area that has radon problems in the area. Now, most of that stuff we see up around the Columbia River, that's where our well field is, so that stuff makes its way into our drinking water. This stuff can affect homes also, but there are ways to mitigate that, and every home in those zip codes should be tested for radon. My point being is that we don't want, if they're going to mitigate for the house for radon, they can do that very easily. But what we don't want is to radon to come in through covered reservoirs, not being able to vent, coming into our drinking water system, where your showers and your toilets and drinking water as a whole are allowing radon to vent into your homes. And there is, regardless what EPA says, they contradict themselves by giving an action level, but EPA says very clearly that there is no safe level of radon. No safe level.
And that's a naturally occurring radioactivity.
It's a naturally occurring radioactivity that generates from soil, from uranium, then it decays to radium, and then to radon gas. And radon gas is very soluble in water. This is the thing that technology that we had asked for. We'd asked for things to go into the open reservoirs that will allow for us to detect contaminants early on, and the Water Bureau hasn't done that. This is a laser thing that was developed many years ago, and it can detect chemicals and microorganisms and can provide an early warning, but we don't have that, and it's very easy to handle. We've also asked for bird wires to be put on the open reservoirs, and because they've been successful in other cities, and our Water Bureau refuses to do that.
Was that bird wires?
Bird wires will keep birds out of there, and will eliminate that whole issue of having birds maybe land in the water. And there are solutions to that aren't being utilized, and they're very inexpensive, very, very inexpensive.
Well, how about birds that are flying over and relieve themselves into the water?
It's always a possibility, and that's why they measure and look at the water, and that's why we find so many samples that have zero coliforms. And if you look at the data over the years, there are very few detects of coliforms in our drinking water, whether it's in the system or in the reservoir. And that's the thing too, that we are testing throughout the whole system, we just aren't finding any. And it's especially downstream from the reservoir, and that's where they would be showing up. This is one of the problems from the Seattle reservoirs there. This is an example of what we were looking at earlier, only through a schematic side view diagram. And that covering at the top, we see in the orange, is where that membrane was. Now this is a good example. You can see where there is no ability for these gases to escape and no ability for the sun to disinfect. And especially in a dark environment like that, with nitrogen part of being ammonia, nitrification can take place through bacteria, then that causes cancer-causing problems also. The sunlight from an open reservoir inhibits that type of activity. It inhibits the bacteria from doing that. And that's another benefit of the open reservoirs.
So I see that they not only cover it, but then they have soil and then grass over the top.
Right, and the grass and the moisture from that and the bacteria that are coming down through the grass on top of that petrochemical membrane will, over time, will degrade that, and there you'll see that these contaminants can find their way in. If you look closely at the top of the reservoir here, this is an example of the one in Seattle. there are cracks and seams where the slabs have come together, and that's where water can enter into it. And that's what they found when in the early detections of the Seattle defective reservoirs. And those are always going to be there.
Oh, they'll be using fertilizers on the lawns.
Exactly.
And pesticides possibly.
Exactly. And that's all going to find its way. This is the thing that really has concerned during the independent review panel. This was one of the things that was concern of them. It wasn't the contamination of the open reservoirs. It was if somebody had the motive to do it, this is called backflow. And this is somebody in their own home or a business or even coming up to a fire hydrant can put contaminants back into the system with a higher pressure. I really don't like talking about this, but it's something the community needs to know, that this is higher risk than an open reservoir, because we can detect things very quickly in an open reservoir. If this is in the distribution system, it would be a long time before it would be found out. And this is very easy. If somebody was going to do it, this is the way they would do it.
Well, by definition, if you're doing it in an open reservoir, you're doing it in the open. Whereas in here, you're not in the open.
There are cameras, there are security people there, there are sensors in the reservoirs that should be there, and the open reservoirs provide much better public health than they do risk. One of the things that the community has been hearing about is that the City Council is looking at a variance for the treatment up in Bull Run. They're not looking for a variance at this point for the open reservoirs, which is very unfortunate, because New York and other utilities have been applying for a variance in their open reservoirs because they know, in all the testing that they've done, they found it not to be a problem. So for the last 3 years we've been doing this variance process, and the activists that were supporting this variance process were saying, well, it'll buy us time in order for us to talk to the congressional people. But all that has happened is that the time was used for Portland to increase rates and to increase their building projects like we see up at the Powell Butte. And I don't feel that this is the right way to go, because it's a temporary solution. It has to be reviewed every 3 years. And that's the big contrast to what we're going to look at next. The waiver is really the answer for what we need, and that's what we should be asking in a stronger voice to our representatives at the congressional level, the Senator Wyden and Merkley, and Congressman Blumenauer and Schrader and Wu, that they can make this into a legislative thing versus a renewable thing every 3 years. We need congressional intervention. The Portland Water Bill will say to us, and they do say, that a waiver is not part of the Safe Drinking Water Act. Well, it is. I don't know why they say that, but it is. We are currently under a waiver with the Safe Drinking Water Act. It's called a filtration avoidance determination. So the waiver is available to us, and all we have to do is ask for it in a stronger voice.
So the congressional delegations can't do anything until the city makes a move in that direction first.
That's what they're telling us, and so Mr. Leonard is the gatekeeper. So in a summary, this LT2 has been a distraction for a new water source in the Willamette and the Columbia River, and that's been their long-term goal, is to regionalize this whole system. Sewage is not the problem. Sewage is the problem. I'm sorry, not the Cryptosporidium, and that's been very clear. There have been no harmful. There have been no utilities since Milwaukee, water utilities that have had a problem with Cryptosporidium, and that's almost been 20 years now. So if there was going to be a problem with Cryptosporidium, we would have seen it over time, and we just haven't. None of the assertions that EPA put out that would support this regulation have come true, not one. And these added chemicals, from the formaldehyde to the chemicals are going to be ingested and inhaled through the covered reservoirs, none of them are healthy. And none of the nothing that they can do to treat Bull Run will make it any better. The open reservoirs have been a very good benefit to our public health and have been good for over 100 years. And the same thing with the Bull Run. It's very simple, and the people who designed the system were really well aware of what they were doing and what the benefits would be. This is what we should be doing. This is, these guys are removing a plastic pipe, which is really not good in a drinking water system because it can react with chlorine and can leach chemicals across from the soil across the plastic into the drinking water, and that comes from EPA. That is not my opinion. So these things, I hope we can remove them, the ones that we do have in our system. But the deferred maintenance that we have, that can provide long-term permanent jobs. And we have thousands and thousands of hours of deferred maintenance in our water system that have not been addressed over the years that really need to be. And that's going to be a problem in the future. We should be spending our money on that, is what I'm saying, and not adding treatment that we don't need or covering a reservoir that doesn't need to be covered as long as we put in a risk mitigation situation, we can be very happy with the water that we have, and the reservoirs will be around for many, many decades to come. So there are new concerns. The federal people in Congress are hearing more from the communities of concerns from environmental chemicals. And so this is kind of an opportunity for us to say we want fewer chemicals in our drinking water than what this regulation would propose. And that's what part of our equation that we need to be telling our elected officials. There are new reviews going on now through the Toxic Substance Control Act and the Safe Chemical Act that are both part of EPA because of concerns from the communities around the nation of them receiving antibiotics and hormones and pharmaceuticals and other contaminants in their drinking water, that they don't want that. And because the regulations of EPA are really outdated and really don't apply to the general population. So what I'm asking for tonight is that the audience take written action with your families and friends and talk to 3 people and have them talk to 3 people and move this thing along. Elected officials, we want a waiver. We don't want added chemicals, and we don't want to pay over $1 billion along with the debt service that will go along with it for generations to come for no benefit. There's no reason we have to do this, to add treatment to our drinking water or cover our reservoirs.
And so what you're saying, all right, thank you all. So what you're saying is to people, write letters and contact the city council.
Right. Contact City Council, start there. Contact all of our congressional people. Contact your neighborhood association. Make phone calls to these people. Inundate them with phone calls that you want this thing to start. You want to get this thing going. We've got an opportunity now for the community to really get involved, and I hope that they take advantage of it, because we're really at the 11th hour for this whole process. We've been trying for many years to get the attention of the City Council. They really don't care, because as the water rates go up, 5% of the water rate for the water and sewer goes into, it's called the utility license fee, and that goes into the general fund. The more the water rates go up, the more money they get into their general fund. There's no incentive for them to restrict the water rates, and they have no incentive to stop this process unless we tell them. They're aware of the chemicals, they're aware of the hazards, they just defer time and time again to EPA, and we need to get out of the middle process between the council and the congressional people and get this thing going.
From what you're saying, it looks to me like this is being treated more as a business decision than as a health decision.
They understand the health aspects of it, and they're well aware of it, and you're right. It's a business decision. The bottom line is money. The money, and we can create jobs through the deferred maintenance. We don't need to create jobs through building these things that we don't need. So that's part of the equation. But because of the politics of the money, this is what we're dealing with. You're right. It is a business deal.
you know, I remember the shot you had of the jobs that could be made with those plastic pipes, and I've always thought that, you know, a lot of, they said, what a problem with the Roman Empire was their use of lead piping for their water. And I thought, well, we don't have that problem anymore. We have plastic, and now plastic's an issue too as well now.
Plastic is an issue, and it's just there because of cost. And see, this is what is kind of confusing, because this is a product that is known to be toxic, that is being referred to by the engineers who are running our show, and it just doesn't make sense.
You know, what really struck me right off the bat was that one of them first slides that you talked about was this was all designed by engineers, but you didn't once mention a biologist in any of that.
Right.
And that's the scariest part of this whole thing.
Well, it is, and they're really, we've seen maybe 3 or 4 microbiologists involved in this whole process. There may be more, but we haven't seen them. And what's unfortunate and disappointing to me is each one of those microbiologists has a financial interest in this. One of the microbiologists that is involved with sampling and stuff around the nation is also involved with designing the ultraviolet radiation plant. So they have a very distinct interest in getting us to use ultraviolet radiation, because they're going to make money from the sampling, and they're going to make money from the treatment itself that we don't need.
Mm-hmm. So it just seems to me that, you know, we got about 12 minutes left. We might open up the phones if folks want to call up and find out some information. I forgot what I was going to go into next, but we should mention again that you do have a website.
Right, Friends of Safe Drinking Water, and it'll be up and running in the next few days.
So it has been a website, and you're just bringing it up to speed, or you're just now getting started with it?
Just now getting started with it.
Right.
Yeah.
So we need to get there. We got the phone number up there. I really hope folks want to call up and ask some questions, because this is it seems like a complicated issue. At least it did to me before, but now it's pretty straightforward. It looks to me like there's a 1-2 punch going on. I mean, the one punch is with the chemicals being added to it, but I was not aware of covering these up could cause so much problem. That the reservoirs are able to breathe and dissipate a lot of the problems that could be going on. Problems that are maximized by the chemicals, but even if they were open and those chemicals were put in there, that would tend to alleviate some of the problems with the chemicals, is what I get out of this.
Exactly, and you in these open reservoirs you have a whole set of different bacteria than you do in the closed reservoirs. They're called aerobic bacteria, and they survive in an oxygenated environment. And they are about 20 times more efficient in breaking down chemicals than the ones in the closed environment, the anaerobic bacteria.
Well, that's basically putrefaction is what anaerobic is.
Exactly. So you're going to get off flavors, off gases, all kinds of stuff that you don't get with the fresh water coming out of the open reservoirs. Mm-hmm. These open reservoirs are really, really a gift to the city of Portland, and we need to retain them for public health reasons.
Well, I know many years ago you mentioned something like, I think, what, 1995 or the early 2000, there was a move to cover the reservoirs, and I remember there was a hue and a cry, and I remember there was rallies and marches, and there was hands around the reservoir where people were showing up and linking arms, and enough people showed up to completely encircle one of the reservoirs, and it was stopped. Right. That was before trying to get into a history thing, that was before the EPA rules showed themselves, I take it.
Right. And one of the things that's important to say is that in 2001 we had 9/11, of course, but there was a convening of an independent review panel in early 2004 after the 9/11. So they were understanding and sensitive to the fact that there could be a terrorist problem with an open reservoir. After months and months and months of deliberation, they determined that the open reservoirs, there was no need to cover them. And this was a very big situation because they discussed everything that we've talked about tonight and the fact of a terrorist attack, and they found that that was not a reason, that the risk of that was not a reason to cover the reservoirs. Mm-hmm. And because that happened after 9/11, this is a very significant thing. They said, do the bird wires, increase security, keep your open reservoirs. Mm-hmm. That's it.
I think we have a phone call. We'll get your first caller up. First caller, you're on the air.
Oh, hi.
Hello.
I'm not sure how this is coming through. Is it okay?
We hear you. Can you hear us?
Yeah.
Oh, great.
On the phone, anyway. Yeah.
If you got your TV on, you could turn your TV down.
It's way down.
Okay, good.
Yeah. This is a question for Scott, and this is Kathy calling from Twillerton, and wanting to ask if you have any suggestions. If you're saying to the audience, it sounds like mostly Portland residents, to talk to your city council in Portland. What's your advice for those of us who are customers? Do we talk to our city council, or do we talk to Portland to support the, I'm most particularly interested in the waiver of the LT2. That I think would be wonderful, and especially because the Cryptosporidium that's dangerous is mostly from humans and cattle, not from anything other than bull run.
Well, thank you, Kathy, and you're right. There is nothing harmful coming out of the bull run as far as that organism. I would recommend strongly that you talk to both organizations that you discussed here, that you talk to the City Council and you talk to your Tualatin Valley Water District, but you also need to talk to your elected representatives, Senator Wyden, Senator Merkley. In your area, you'd have Congressman Wu and Congressman Schrader. So if you could hit those three groups, the congressional people, the Portland City Council, and the Tualatin Valley Water District people, you'd be covering a very wide area, and that would be very, very helpful, because you're right, and that's a good point. I'm glad you brought up. This water does not only affect the city of Portland, but it affects Gresham, Tigard, Beaverton, Tualatin, and all the areas in between, and there are about 10 or 12 different water utilities that buy Bull Run water, so it does impact almost 800,000 people. We're the biggest water supplier of Bull Run in the state, so it's very critical that all three regions of the, and it goes into Clackamas County also, all three regions, all three counties get involved and talk to those people I just described.
Mm-hmm. I think that a lot of folks get their water like from the Clackamas, so that those folks wouldn't be involved in this at all.
Not directly at this time, but part of that process of the regional transmission and storage document that I have includes those areas to be ultimately drinking Willamette River water also. So the whole region will be drinking Willamette River water if the engineers have their way, and that's what we're trying to stop.
Mm-hmm. I don't understand why we need to be drinking Willamette River water. We can get adequate water coming from the Bull Run watershed. Why do we need to do that? Or why are they saying we need to do that?
It goes back to money. It goes back to the fact that that plant is not being utilized to its full capacity. And it's interesting that you bring up Bull Run water. We've seen a very strong trend over the last decade or so of decrease in water use from the Bull Run because of conservation and because other utilities like Gresham and Rockwood have drilled into their own groundwater that they use during the summer, and other areas do too. So the usage of Bull Run water has actually decreased. So
even as the population increases.
Even as the population increased through the conservation and through the other alternative water sources.
Mm-hmm. I've always been curious about that, because we hear that people, they want to sell us, or they want us to drink Willamette River water, and apparently from what you're saying, there's already been, I didn't know this, I probably should have, that there's been a filtration system or some kind of system already built that is providing water from the Willamette to some segments of the Portland metropolitan area.
Exactly. Wilsonville and Sherwood, and
okay.
they're trying to get other utilities to go in it. I believe Tualatin and Tigard and the Tualatin Valley Water District have their citizens have opted not to use the Willamette River water, and mm-hmm. citizens like in Kathy's area and Kathy herself have been very vocal in not using Willamette River water, but there's a big trend pushed by the engineers to utilize that plant to its capacity.
Mm-hmm. Now, is that owned by a French company?
Veolia is managing it. I believe it is still owned partially by Wilsonville and the Tualatin Valley Water District. Mm-hmm. But the engineer who designed it is the same one who wants to treat our Bull Run water, who wants to cover our reservoirs, who wrote the LT2, and who made those defective reservoirs up in Seattle. It's the same guy.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a very clear pattern.
It's not just the same mentality, it's the same person there.
Yeah.
I don't understand how that can go on. You know, I didn't know about this thing up in Seattle, and it just seems crazy that they can have such problems with something, and our city council and mayor aren't taking that into consideration. How does the mayor weigh in on this, or does he?
He goes along with Mr. Leonard. Initially,
Because Mr. Leonard's his point man for water.
right, and Mr. Leonard appointed the administrator of the Water Bureau, who is the good friend of this engineer who has this whole thing wrapped up.
Mm-hmm.
So he knew what he was getting into, apparently. But it still goes down to money, and it still goes down to we need to step up as a community to say no.
Right. Well, it seems to me that I think from all this, I think the mayor needs to hear from people out there just about more than anybody else. And yeah, he has these folks that, you know, each council member, city commissioner has their areas that they take care of. But he's still the mayor. You know, he needs to be dealing with his issues, maybe take what they have to say and what they learn through their aides and all. But, you know, he has a vote, and it just seems to me that he needs to be aware more than anybody of how people feel about this. I mean, it may be different, you know, in your mind. I don't know, but it just from what I get from this is the mayor needs to hear from us.
He does. He does. That's very clear. Yes, he does. All of the council members need to hear from us. All of the congressional people need to hear from us, and we need to speak with one voice very strongly. Mm-hmm. We want a waiver. We want it now. We don't want treatment. We don't want to spend money for a problem that doesn't exist.
So your bio in the beginning, you're a microbiologist?
Right.
Is there any other microbiologists? Since they didn't make the decision and it was all engineers designing this, is there any other microbiologists that have been studying this that are coming out for or against it?
Well, yes. Like New York City has a very strong group of people that are working very hard and have worked very hard over the years to show that their system is extremely clean and extremely well taken care of, maintained. They also have had a very strong program in New York City of monitoring for Cryptosporidium within the community and looking at the disease patterns, and nothing has ever been shown to be linked to drinking water, ever. Mm-hmm. So that's been very important. And yeah, but again, it goes back to what we started with one of the first slides, is that the politics of some of the EPA microbiologists, they're very afraid of whistleblowing because of the money that's involved with grants that they would get that are related to other subjects. There's a lot of money to be made in Cryptosporidium, but it's really controlled by those 3 or 4 that I talked about earlier, microbiologists that are doing the studies and getting the money for it.
Mm-hmm. So, well, now we're down to less than a minute. So, Scott, I really appreciate you coming on and bringing this great information. It's, you know, we've all probably been hearing a little bit about this over here and a little bit about this over there. And I never had any detailed discussion of this, and it's been great. And I'm glad we got a phone call from that one person that brought up a good point. So we're down to about 30 seconds. I appreciate the information. I want to thank the crew. They're out there. Hopefully they're listening to this as well, and we'll be back actually we'll be back in 2 weeks because I'm not going to be here next week, and we'll be going into Christmas season pretty soon, and we'll be closed towards the end of the month. But Scott, keep up the good work.
Thank you very much for having me tonight and for getting the message out. And people, write your elected officials.